The email subject line alone made my stomach drop. Invoice, outstanding balance. At first, I thought it was spam, some phishing attempt dressed up in corporate language, hoping fear would make me click before thinking. I almost deleted it without opening it. Then I saw the sender, my mother. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my cursor hovering over the email like it might bite me. My mother didn't send emails like this. She preferred texts, sharp ones, or phone calls that started calm and ended with her voice tight and disappointed. Emails were for things she wanted documented. That should have been my first warning. I opened it. Attached was a PDF, 3 pages long, formatted professionally, numbered line items, bold headers. At the top, in all caps, cost of raising a failure. Total amount due, $347,218.64. I felt my breath catch, like my lungs had forgotten what they were supposed to do. For a second, the room tilted. Then I laughed. A short, startled sound that came out of me before I could stop it, because it was absurd, and because part of me, some quiet, deeply trained part, immediately wondered if she was serious. I scrolled. The breakdown was meticulous. Housing, birth to age 18, $182,000. Food and utilities, $64,500. Education-related expenses, $41,300. Medical and insurance, $22,100. Extracurriculars and wasted opportunities, $37,318.64. Each line had notes beside it, little comments, little judgments. You quit piano, did not pursue scholarships seriously. Emotional support not reciprocated. No return on investment. My hands were shaking now, not violently, just enough to notice. At the bottom of the page was a note typed in the same clinical font as everything else. Given your current age and continued lack of achievement, I believe reimbursement is appropriate. Below that, her signature, digitally signed, like this was a contract. I closed the laptop slowly. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I sat there, staring at nothing, my mind doing something strange, jumping backward instead of forward.
To childhood, to dinner tables where she'd sigh heavily and say things like, "You don't know how much I've sacrificed for you." To report cards that were good, but never good enough. To the way she'd compare me to other people's children without even pretending not to. So-and-so's daughter already bought a house. At least she appreciates her parents. I just don't know where I went wrong with you. I'd learned early that love came with an invoice. I just hadn't expected her to itemize it. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew whatever I said would be used later, weaponized, archived. My mother loved receipts. Instead, I called my grandmother, her mother, the woman who had helped raise me when my mother was busy reminding me how expensive I was. She answered on the second ring. "Hi, sweetheart," she said warmly, and just like that, my throat tightened. I got an email from Mom," I said carefully. A pause, then a sigh. What did she do now? I swallowed. "She sent me a bill." Silence. "A bill?" my grandmother repeated. "For raising me?" Another pause, longer this time. "How much?" she asked. I hesitated. $347,000. I expected disbelief, shock, laughter. Instead, my grandmother exhaled slowly, like she'd just been handed confirmation of something she'd suspected for years. "Did she label it?" she asked. "Yes," I said quietly. "What did she call it?" I closed my eyes. "Cost of raising a failure." The line went dead silent. For a full 5 seconds, I thought the call had dropped. Then my grandmother spoke. Her voice was calm. too calm. "Oh," she said. She finally did it. My stomach sank. "Did what?" "Show you exactly who she is," my grandmother replied. I sat back in my chair, stunned. "You're not surprised?" I asked. "No," she said. "I'm angry, but not surprised." There was movement on her end, like she was standing up. "Do not respond to her," she continued firmly. "Do you hear me?" "Yes," I said automatically. "She's been keeping score your entire life," my grandmother said. "This is just the first time she's written it down." I felt something crack open in my chest, because part of me had always hoped I was imagining it, that I was too sensitive, too dramatic, that if I just tried harder, achieved more, proved enough, she'd stop tallying. "She has no legal standing," my grandmother went on, "and no moral one either." "I know," I said. You just feel like you're 12 years old again," she finished gently, "trying to explain yourself to someone who already decided the verdict." Tears burned behind my eyes. I hadn't told her that part. "Listen to me," my grandmother said. "I need you to forward that email to me." I hesitated. "Why?" "Because," she replied, her voice hardening, "if she's going to start sending invoices, then it's time someone responds properly." Something about the way she said properly made my skin prickle. "Grandma," I said slowly, "what are you planning to do?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she said, "Do you know why I helped pay for your college books?" "Yes," I said. "Because you wanted to." "No," she corrected, "because your mother told me she couldn't justify the expense." My jaw dropped. "She told me you didn't appreciate it, that you were ungrateful, that you'd probably drop out anyway." I stared at the wall. "That's not what she told me," I whispered. "I know," my grandmother said softly. "That's the point." Suddenly, the invoice made sense, not as a joke, not as a tantrum, but as escalation. This wasn't about money, it was about control, about rewriting the narrative before someone else did. "I raised you too," my grandmother said, "in ways she conveniently forgets." I remembered that. Sleeping at Grandma's when Mom said she needed space. The way Grandma never complained about cost, never counted, never reminded me. She just showed up. "I don't want you to worry," my grandmother continued, "but I do want you to be prepared." "For what?" I asked. "For the fact that once this starts," she said, "it doesn't stay private." My heart skipped. "You think she'll tell people?" "I think she already has," my grandmother replied. My phone buzzed. A text from my cousin. "Hey, random question. Did you and your mom have some kind of financial disagreement?" I closed my eyes. "She already did," I said quietly. My grandmother made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff. "Then it's good timing," she said. "For what?" "For me to stop being polite." I straightened in my chair. "Grandma," I said carefully, "what are you going to do?" She paused, then said very calmly, "I'm going to send your mother a response." My pulse spiked. "A response?" "Yes," she said, "and mine is going to be far more expensive." I swallowed. "More expensive how?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "Do you still have the box in the hall closet?" My breath caught. "The one with your baby records, your school papers, the letters?" "Yes," I whispered. "Good," she said, "because I kept copies." My stomach flipped. "Copies of what?" I asked. My grandmother's voice dropped, slow and deliberate. "Everything your mother didn't want you to know." The line went quiet for a moment. Then she added, "And by the time she's done reading my response, she's going to wish she'd never sent that bill."
I stared at my closed laptop, the invoice still sitting there like a loaded weapon. And for the first time since opening that email, I wasn't afraid, because whatever my mother thought she was collecting, my grandmother was about to charge her back, with interest. And this story, it was only just beginning. Not because I suddenly expected her mother to show up at my door with a clipboard and a calculator, but because my entire childhood was suddenly replaying itself in a new light. Every sigh, every "after all I've done for you," every time she reminded me how much I owed her, without ever saying the word owed. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the tick of the clock, realizing something uncomfortable. The invoice wasn't a breaking point.
It was a reveal. By morning, my phone had 3 missed calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months, 2 texts from people who never checked in unless there was gossip involved, and 1 voicemail from my mother. I didn't listen to it. Not yet. Instead, I made coffee, sat at my small kitchen table, and opened my laptop again. The PDF was still there, still pristine, still smug. I scrolled through it more carefully this time, no longer stunned, just observant. She hadn't counted love. She hadn't counted time, only money. As if parenting were a failed business venture and I was a bad stock. My phone buzzed. "Grandma, did you sleep?" Me. "Not really." 3 dots appeared almost immediately. "Grandma. Good, that means you're thinking." I smiled faintly. Me. "You scared me yesterday." A pause. "Grandma. I meant to." That made my chest tighten, because my grandmother never scared anyone unless it was necessary. Around noon, I finally listened to my mother's voicemail. Her voice was controlled, too controlled. "Hi," she said, like we were coworkers. "I assume you saw the email. I know it might feel harsh, but I think it's important we're realistic about where things stand. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. Call me when you're ready to discuss." No anger, no yelling, just entitlement dressed as calm. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask how I felt. She assumed compliance. I forwarded the email to my grandmother just like she asked. 10 minutes later, she called. "I'm going to need you to listen carefully," she said, "and I need you to trust me." "I do," I replied. "Your mother has been rewriting history for years," she said, "not just with you, with everyone." My stomach twisted. "Rewriting how?" "By positioning herself as the sole provider," my grandmother replied, "the martyr, the one who carried the entire burden." "That's what she's always said," I murmured. "Yes," my grandmother said, "and it's not true." She told me things I'd never heard before. That my mother hadn't paid for my daycare alone. My grandmother had covered most of it. That the private lessons my mother loved to bring up were paid for by a trust my grandfather left behind. That the medical expenses listed in the invoice, covered by insurance my grandmother insisted on keeping active when my mother wanted to cancel it to save money. She took credit, my grandmother said, for everything she didn't want to acknowledge help for. I felt something hot rise in my chest. Anger. Clean. Focused. Sharp. "So she billed me for things she didn't even pay for," I said slowly. "Yes," my grandmother replied. "And for sacrifices she chose to make, then resented." I thought about the line item that read, "extracurriculars and wasted opportunities." "How does she even decide what counts as wasted?" I asked. My grandmother let out a short laugh. "Anything you didn't do exactly her way." That stung because it was true. I'd quit piano because it made my hands shake. I'd chosen a different major than the one she wanted. I'd taken a job she called temporary, even though it paid my bills and didn't crush my spirit. To her, deviation was failure. Here's the part you need to understand.
my grandmother said. "This invoice isn't about money." "I know," I said. "It's about humiliation," she continued. "She wants you to feel small, publicly." My phone buzzed again. Another message. This time from my aunt. "Your mom is really upset. She says you're refusing to take responsibility for how much she sacrificed." I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. "She's already framing it," I said quietly. "Of course she is," my grandmother replied, "which is why my response needs to be precise." "Grandma," I said carefully, "what exactly are you going to send her?" There was a pause. Then she said, "An accounting." My heart skipped. "Of what?" "Of the truth," she said, "with documentation." The next few days were surreal. My mother didn't escalate directly. Instead, she activated the network. Relatives called just to check in. Friends of the family sent vague messages about healing and gratitude. One even said, "Parents don't owe children anything. Children owe parents everything." I didn't reply. I stopped defending myself. I'd spent my entire life explaining. I was done. Meanwhile, my grandmother worked quietly. She dug through old files. Bank statements, receipts, canceled checks, letters. She found proof of payments she'd made on my behalf that my mother had claimed as her own. Proof of support she'd offered when my mother told people she was doing it alone. Proof of lies, not dramatic ones, but consistent ones, the most dangerous kind. One evening, my grandmother came to my apartment. She brought a thick folder and a small cardboard box. We sat at my table, the same one where I'd first opened the invoice. "This is everything I have copies of," she said. I kept them because I didn't trust her memory. I opened the folder slowly. There were years of records. My name appeared everywhere. My mother's name appeared less than she'd claimed. I swallowed. "This changes everything." My grandmother nodded. "Yes, and that's why she didn't want you talking to me." I looked up sharply. "What?" "She discouraged it," my grandmother said gently. "She didn't forbid it, she's smarter than that, but she made it inconvenient, uncomfortable." Memories clicked into place. The sighs when I mentioned grandma, the way visits were always rushed, the comments about her being old-fashioned or dramatic. Isolation, slow and quiet. "So what happens now?" I asked. My grandmother closed the folder. "Now," she said, "I send her my response." "And?" I pressed. "And she'll either back down," my grandmother continued, "or she'll double down." My chest tightened. "And if she doubles down?" My grandmother looked me straight in the eye. "Then the rest of the family will see who's really keeping score." That night, my mother sent another message. "If you don't respond by Friday, I'll assume you're refusing responsibility and will proceed accordingly." Proceed accordingly, like I was a delinquent account. I forwarded it to my grandmother. She replied with one sentence. "Good. Deadlines focus people." Friday morning, my grandmother sent the email, not just to my mother, but CC'd to every relative my mother had already contacted. The subject line was simple: RE, invoice, outstanding balance. No sarcasm, no theatrics, just confidence. She attached a document of her own, titled Accounting of Actual Contributions and Misrepresentations. I didn't read it right away. I couldn't. My hands were shaking again, but this time not from fear, from anticipation. My phone exploded within the hour. Missed calls, texts, voicemails. One message stood out. From my cousin, the same one who'd asked earlier. "I just read Grandma's email. Is Mom okay?" I stared at the words. Not, "Are you okay?" But it didn't matter. Something had shifted. My mother called. I didn't answer. She called again. And again. Finally, she left a voicemail. This one wasn't calm.
"This is unbelievable," she snapped. "How dare she undermine me like this? How dare you let her?" Let her. I closed my eyes. For the first time, her anger didn't scare me. It exposed her. An hour later, my grandmother called me. "Did you see the replies?" she asked. "No," I admitted. She smiled. I could hear it in her voice. "Good," she said, "because the worst one hasn't come yet." My stomach flipped. "What do you mean?" I asked. "She's going to respond," my grandmother said, "and when she does—" She paused. "She's going to tell on herself." I swallowed. "Grandma," I said quietly, "what if this destroys the family?" There was no hesitation in her answer. "Sweetheart," she said, "a family that survives by humiliating one of its own was already broken." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling again. Only this time, I wasn't replaying the past. I was watching it unravel, and I had a feeling. My mother's invoice was about to become the most expensive mistake she'd ever made. The silence after my grandmother's email was louder than any argument. For almost 6 hours, nothing happened. No replies, no calls, no dramatic follow-ups, just quiet. And that's when I knew my mother was furious. Because when she's calm, she performs. When she's angry, she plans. And when she's exposed, she freezes. I spent that afternoon pacing my apartment, phone in hand, resisting the urge to refresh my inbox every 30 seconds. At around 4:17 p.m., the first reply came. Not from my mother, from my aunt. "Aunt, I had no idea. Is this accurate?" Before I could respond, another message appeared. From my uncle. "I think we need to slow down and talk about this privately." Privately. That word again. The universal reflex of people who benefit from things staying unexamined. My grandmother called me shortly after. "She hasn't responded yet, has she?" she asked. "No," I said. "She will," my grandmother replied. "And when she does, she'll try to regain control by reframing." Reframing how? "By shifting the issue from facts to feelings," my grandmother said. "Watch for words like hurt, betrayal, and disrespect." As if on cue, my phone buzzed. Incoming email. From my mother. The subject line was different this time. "I never thought you'd do this to me." I didn't open it immediately. I didn't need to. I already knew what was inside. Still, I took a deep breath and read it carefully. It was long, emotional, and carefully vague. She wrote about sacrifice, about loneliness, about how hard it was being a single mother. She accused my grandmother of meddling, of rewriting history, of turning her own child against her. She didn't address the numbers. She didn't deny the payments. She didn't dispute the documentation. She attacked character instead. And then came the line that made my stomach drop. "If you had been a different kind of daughter, none of this would be necessary."
There it was, the thesis of my entire childhood. She CC'd everyone. Of course she did. She wanted witnesses. She wanted sympathy. She wanted the narrative back. Replies started coming in. Some people agreed with her, not directly, but with silence. Others sent messages like, "I'm sure both sides have valid feelings. This shouldn't be public. Families shouldn't keep score." I almost laughed. Families shouldn't keep score until someone sends a bill. My grandmother was unfazed. "She didn't deny anything," she said when I read the email to her. "That's important." "She blamed me," I said quietly. "Of course she did," my grandmother replied. "Blame is her shield." "But people are taking her side," I said. "Some will," she acknowledged. "They always do, especially the ones who benefit from the status quo." That stung because I knew exactly who she meant. Then my mother crossed a line. She sent a second email. This one wasn't to the group. It was just to me. The subject line was sharp, "Final notice." My chest tightened as I opened it. She gave me a deadline, 10 days to acknowledge the debt, to agree to a repayment discussion, or she'd explore formal options, legal options. I felt my hands go cold. She couldn't possibly mean that, could she? I forwarded the email to my grandmother immediately. She called me within minutes. "Do not respond," she said firmly. "She's threatening me," I said. "She's bluffing," my grandmother replied, "and even if she weren't, she'd lose." "But she's serious," I insisted. "She sent it like a demand letter." "She sent it like someone who's panicking," my grandmother corrected. "She's losing control of the story." I swallowed.
What if she sues me?
"She won't," my grandmother said, "because discovery would ruin her." That stopped me. Ruin her how? "Because then," my grandmother said slowly, "she'd have to explain where the money actually came from." That night, I barely ate. I kept replaying the word failure in my head, not because I believed it, but because she'd used it so many times it had grooves in my mind. I wondered how many choices I'd made trying to disprove a label she'd already assigned. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from my cousin. "I'm really uncomfortable with what's happening. Can we talk?" I hesitated, then agreed. We met at a cafe halfway between our apartments. She looked nervous. "I read everything," she said after we ordered, "both sides." "And?" I asked. She stirred her drink slowly. "Something doesn't add up." My heart lifted slightly. "What do you mean?" "She keeps saying she did everything alone," my cousin continued, "but I remember Grandma helping, a lot." I nodded. "And the invoice," she added, lowering her voice, "that's not normal, right?" I almost laughed. "No, it's not." She exhaled. "I'm glad you said that." Word spread faster after that, not because of arguments, but because of questions. People started asking my mother for clarification, for specifics, for proof, and every time she avoided details, the ground shifted under her feet. 2 days later, my grandmother sent a follow-up. Not aggressive, not emotional, just factual. She addressed my mother directly, pointed out what hadn't been denied, asked for clarification on the inflated amounts, attached additional documentation. It was devastating in its restraint. My mother responded within minutes, angrily. She accused my grandmother of betrayal, of jealousy, of trying to erase her motherhood. And then, without meaning to, she revealed something crucial. She wrote, "I shouldn't have to justify every dollar I spent on my own child." There it was, an admission. She hadn't kept accurate records. She'd estimated, assumed, rounded up, turned emotion into currency. The replies stopped defending her after that, not because people suddenly loved me, but because they recognized instability, and instability makes people back away. That evening, my grandmother came over again. She looked tired, but satisfied. "She's unraveling," she said. "I don't want her destroyed," I said quietly. My grandmother looked at me gently. "I know," she said. "That's why this will end soon." "How?" "She'll retreat," my grandmother replied. "Or she'll escalate." "And if she escalates?" My grandmother smiled, small, sharp. "Then I tell her the part she doesn't want anyone to hear." My pulse spiked. "What part?" She met my eyes. "The reason she's so angry," she said, "is because that invoice wasn't about the past." I frowned. Then what was it about? My grandmother's voice dropped. It was about what she thinks she's entitled to next. The words hung between us, cold, heavy. And suddenly, the $347,000 bill didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like a down payment on a control she was about to lose. Once my grandmother said that, it wasn't about the past. Everything snapped into focus. The invoice wasn't a reckoning. It was a test, a probe, a way to see if I'd finally push back or quietly accept a new role. I started noticing patterns I'd ignored before. The timing, the language, the sudden urgency. My mother hadn't sent that bill during one of her emotional outbursts. She'd waited until my life looked, from the outside, stable. Not impressive by her standards, but stable. I had my own place, no debt, a job I liked, distance. Distance was the real problem. She couldn't reach me the way she used to, so she tried something louder. 2 days after my grandmother's last email, my mother showed up at my apartment, unannounced. I froze when I heard the knock, not because I was afraid of her, but because I was tired. I looked through the peephole. There she was, perfectly put together. Coat buttoned, hair neat, expression tight with restraint, like she was attending a meeting, not confronting her daughter. I didn't open the door right away. I needed a moment to remind myself I was not 12. I did not owe her access, and I didn't have to absorb whatever she brought with her. When I finally opened it, she smiled, a practiced smile. "I thought we should talk face to face," she said. I stepped aside. Against my better judgment, I let her in. She sat on my couch like she owned it, like she'd paid for it. She looked around my apartment with quick, appraising glances. "You've done okay for yourself," she said. "I'll give you that. Not, 'I'm proud of you,' just acknowledgement." I didn't respond. She folded her hands in her lap. "This has gone far enough," she said calmly. "Your grandmother had no right to involve herself." "She involved herself because you involved everyone else," I replied. Her eyes flashed. "I was trying to handle this privately." I let out a short laugh. "You CC'd half the family." "That was to be transparent," she snapped. "No, that was to shame me." She stiffened. She shifted tactics quickly, always did. "I never wanted this to turn into a fight," she said softly. "I just wanted you to understand what I gave up." I felt my jaw tighten. "You didn't give up your life," I said. "You chose to be a parent." Her eyes hardened. "You have no idea what that cost me." I met her gaze. "And you have no idea what it cost me to grow up feeling like a debt." That landed. Not because it changed her mind, but because it exposed something she didn't want to discuss. She stood abruptly and began pacing. "You think your grandmother's documents change anything?" she said. "Money isn't the point." I almost smiled, because finally, she said it out loud. "Then why send the invoice?" I asked. She stopped pacing, because she didn't have a clean answer. After a long pause, she said, "Because you've never acknowledged what I did for you." I stared at her. "I spent my entire childhood trying to acknowledge it. Nothing was ever enough." She crossed her arms. "You left," she said accusingly. "I grew up," I replied. The real moment came when she said the thing she didn't plan to say. "You owe me," she snapped. "If not money, then loyalty." There it was, the truth beneath the invoice. My stomach dropped. "I don't owe you my life," I said. Her voice rose. "I gave you yours." "And I didn't ask for it to come with conditions," I replied. Silence slammed into the room. She grabbed her purse. "This is what happens when you let people poison you," she said bitterly. "You turn against your own mother." I didn't argue, because arguing would have implied this was still a misunderstanding. It wasn't. She walked to the door, then turned back. "If you don't fix this," she said, "you're going to regret it." I looked at her calmly. "I already regret not setting boundaries sooner." Her face went pale. Then she left. I sank onto the couch, my heart pounding, not with fear, but clarity. She hadn't come to reconcile, she'd come to reassert dominance, and when that failed, she'd threatened consequences. An hour later, my grandmother called. "She came to see you, didn't she?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "She didn't tell me," my grandmother said, "which means it didn't go how she planned."
I smiled faintly. She said I owed her loyalty. My grandmother was quiet for a long moment. Then it's time, she said. Time for what? I asked. To explain why she's suddenly trying to collect, my grandmother replied. My chest tightened. What do you mean? She's running out of money, my grandmother said. The words landed like a dropped glass. Running out? I repeated. Yes, she said. Not broke, but cornered. That night, my grandmother told me the part she'd been holding back. About loans my mother had taken, about a failed investment she'd hidden, about money she expected to inherit but wouldn't. She thought you could guilt you into helping, my grandmother said, or at least scare you. I closed my eyes. The invoice wasn't revenge. It was desperation. And now? I asked. And now she knows you won't fold, my grandmother replied, which means she'll try something bigger. My pulse spiked. Like what? She'll tell people you're cruel, my grandmother said. Ungrateful, cold. I swallowed. She already has. Yes, my grandmother said. But next she'll cry. The following week it happened. A family group message. From my mother. She apologized, sort of. She said she'd been overwhelmed, that she might have gone too far, that she never meant to hurt anyone. She didn't retract the invoice. She didn't explain the lies. She just asked for understanding. Some people immediately responded with relief. I'm glad you're owning it. Families make mistakes. Let's move on. Move on, without accountability. My grandmother replied last. Her message was short, direct, and devastating. She wrote, "Before we move on, I need to clarify something. The invoice sent to my granddaughter was not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated attempt to extract money through humiliation. I have documentation showing that more than half the expenses claimed were not paid by her mother. If this continues, I will release the full accounting publicly." The group went silent. Again. My mother didn't respond. Not that night, not the next day. She stopped calling, stopped texting, stopped posting. She vanished. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at my apartment, handwritten, from my mother. Inside was a single sentence. "I never thought you'd choose her over me." I stared at it for a long time, then folded it neatly and placed it in the box in my closet, not as evidence, but as closure. That invoice had been meant to shrink me, to put me back in my place. Instead, it exposed the truth about her, about me, about the story she'd been telling and the one she couldn't control anymore. And though the worst wasn't over yet, the power had shifted, irreversibly. Because once someone tries to put a price on your worth, they lose the right to define it. And my grandmother, she wasn't done collecting yet. The quiet that followed my grandmother's last message wasn't peaceful. It was defensive. It was the kind of silence people use when they're hoping time will erase what words couldn't. My mother disappeared from the family group chat completely. No reactions, no counter-arguments, no dramatic exits, just absence. And absence, in her case, was an admission. At first, I thought she was regrouping, planning another angle, another narrative, because that's what she'd always done when something didn't go her way. She'd retreat just long enough to reemerge with a revised version of events that made her the injured party again. But days passed, then weeks, and something different started happening. People began reaching out to me. Not aggressively, not defensively, tentatively. My aunt invited me to lunch. "I want to hear your side," she said carefully, as if afraid the ground might crack beneath her. We sat across from each other at a small cafe, the kind my mother would have dismissed as impractical. "I didn't know," my aunt admitted, stirring her soup. "I should have asked questions sooner." I didn't say, "Yes, you should have." I didn't need to. The truth had a way of saying it for me now. Then my cousin texted, then another. Not to gossip, but to clarify, to recalibrate, to quietly distance themselves from a story that no longer made sense. And with every conversation, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not validation, release. My mother, meanwhile, tried one last move. She sent a message directly to my grandmother, not CC'd, not performative, private. She accused her of betrayal, of poisoning the family, of turning me against her. My grandmother didn't argue. She replied with one sentence, "You did that yourself." And then she blocked her. That was the moment I understood something crucial. This wasn't about choosing sides. It was about ending a cycle. A few days later, my grandmother came over.
She looked lighter than she had in years. "You okay?" I asked. She smiled. "Better than okay." We sat at my table again, the same table where this whole thing began. "I want to show you something," she said, pulling out a thin envelope. Inside was a check, made out to me. My stomach dropped. "Grandma, no," I said immediately. She held up a hand. "Listen," she said, "this isn't guilt money, and it's not rescue money." I frowned. "Then what is it?" She smiled softly. "It's freedom money." She explained that years ago, long before the invoice, she'd set aside funds for me, quietly, without conditions, without expectations, because she'd seen the way my mother attached strings to everything. "I didn't want you to feel like love was transactional," she said. Tears burned my eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. "Because I didn't want it to become leverage," she replied, "and because I wanted you to build your own life first." I stared at the check. It wasn't $347,000. It wasn't extravagant, but it was enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to choose. Enough to never feel trapped again. "I'm not accepting this as repayment for anything," I said. She smiled. "Good, because it's not repayment." I swallowed hard. "Then I'll accept it as support." She nodded. "Exactly." Word eventually reached my mother. I don't know how. It always does. She sent one final message. Short, cold. "So she's buying your loyalty now." I read it once, then deleted it, without replying, because I finally understood something she never would. Support doesn't come with invoices. Love doesn't require returns. And loyalty that's demanded is never loyalty at all. Months passed. Life settled. The drama faded into background noise. My mother stopped contacting me entirely. And for the first time, that didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like peace. I started therapy. Not because I was broken, but because I was tired of carrying a ledger in my head, counting emotional debts I never owed. I learned how deeply transactional thinking had shaped my decisions, how often I'd over-explained, over-given, overcompensated, trying to prepay a debt that didn't exist. One afternoon, my therapist asked me a simple question. What would your life look like if you stopped trying to prove you weren't a failure? I didn't answer right away, because the truth startled me. It would look lighter, quieter, mine. I boxed up the invoice. Not to burn it, not to frame it, just to put it where it belonged, in the past. I labeled the box simply, "Receipts I Don't Owe," and slid it into the back of my closet. My grandmother and I grew closer, not because of the conflict, but because of the honesty it forced. She told me stories she'd never shared before, about my mother as a child, about patterns, about warnings she'd ignored because she wanted peace. "I thought loving her meant excusing her," my grandmother admitted one night. "And now?" I asked. "And now I know loving you means protecting you," she said. The family adjusted.
Some people drifted away, others stepped closer. No one asked me to reconcile. No one asked me to apologize. The silence spoke louder than any verdict. And then, 1 year later, something unexpected happened. My mother sent a letter. Not a message, not an email, a letter. Inside was no apology, no explanation, just a check for $347 and a note, "I thought you might appreciate the symbolism." I stared at it, then laughed. Not bitterly, not sadly, just amused. Because even then, she didn't understand. She still thought this was about numbers. I didn't cash the check. I donated it, in her name, to a scholarship fund. Here's the truth I learned the hard way. People who treat love like a transaction will always feel cheated. They will always believe someone owes them. They will always keep score, until the math stops working. My mother sent me a $347,000 bill labeled "Cost of Raising a Failure." What she didn't realize was that she'd finally given me something priceless. Clarity. Clarity about who she was. Clarity about who I wasn't. And clarity about what I would never accept again. I was never a failure. I was a person raised under conditions. And the moment those conditions were exposed, the debt vanished, because love that demands repayment was never love to begin with.